has been that the population of the homelands has increased from 40% of the black population to 53% in 1980. These homelands are in effect puppet states, recognized by nobody other than South Africa, where there is what one might call a co-opted regime. That is, all the homelands are in fact run by blacks, but they're puppet states run by puppet governments where corruption and patronage are widespread. The second thing that underscores the physical separation is the Group Areas Act, which mandates that there shall be separate residential areas for blacks, for whites, for Indians, and for coloureds. Now, what this has meant is that any given area of the country, particularly urban areas, can be rezoned, for example, from black to Indian, which means that blacks are kicked out to make room for Indians. And since this policy has come into effect, 3.4 million people have been relocated. And at present, another 1.7 million are under threat of relocation. The third thing that underscores the physical separation of the peoples of South Africa is the passbook, which is the most obnoxious and abhorrent instrument of apartheid. Now, every black over the age of 16 must register. Fingerprints are taken, and he or she is issued a passbook which states at any given time the reason why that person has the right to be in a given area. No black has the right to be in any white residential area more than 72 hours, unless, number one, they are what is called a contract worker. Now, a contract worker would be a worker who services a hotel, somebody who must be there up to maybe 2 o'clock in the morning, and there again at 6 o'clock in the morning. They are allowed to stay in a white residential area, and they sleep in kind of dormitories that are at the back of a hotel or other facility or the service facility. The second thing is that you have the right to be in a white residential area for more than 72 hours if you have Section 10 rights. That is, if you were born in that white residential area, if you have worked continuously for one employer for 10 years, if you have worked for a number of employers for 15 years, or if you are the wife or the son and daughter of a black worker who has a work permit for that area, you may stay until. But all of these rights are not rights. I should not use the word rights. They are kind of privileges being allowed at the regime. You can, in fact, at any time be sent back to your homeland. The fourth aspect, and perhaps the most insidious aspect of the separation of the races, is that at night, particularly in the urban areas, there is a banishment of black people. They are literally bussed out of the cities to the townships that surround the major white urban areas. Of course, these townships are not adjacent to the white urban area or the white city. They're sufficiently away so that a white person in South Africa can literally live his or her entire life without ever seeing how a black person lives, without ever seeing their housing conditions, without seeing their appalling economic conditions, without ever being exposed, in fact, to any aspect of black life. And of course, because this is so, blacks do not intrude upon the white consciousness. Because this is so, and because the violence that occurs in the black townships does not appear on the state-run television, they do not know the extent of the violence that is going on in the black townships. And let me assure you that we here tonight probably know much more about the violence going on in the black townships than does the average white in South Africa. The second feature that is striking about the country is the pervasiveness of the security system. And I might call it one of pervasive, incipient got an invasive percipient presence. It's there. People know it's there. There is a network of informers that reaches into every niche of life, both in the white community, in the black community, the coloured community, and the Indian community. There's so much so that, let me give you two examples, one I hope humorous, that we had been warned when we got there that you could not absolutely trust anybody in the South African Council of Churches. Beware of those you approach. And after I said playing the tourist for 2 or 3 days, when finally we met up with some officials from the South African Council of Churches, and they inquired as to who we were loath to tell them right out who we were, because we didn't know who in fact they were. And when security is pervasive, it gives rise to that kind of paranoia. The security system is sufficiently pervasive that a black is arrested every 2 minutes for a violation of the pass laws. It is sufficient that the jails in South Africa are filled to 350% of their capacity. It is pervasive enough that they have what is called the Suppression of Communism Act, and communism is both a buzzword in South Africa and they almost have a deep-rooted fear of communism. But under the Suppression of Communism Act, you can be arrested and detained for furthering the aims of communism. The catch-22, of course, is that nowhere in the legislation does this actually stipulate what are the goals of communism. Under Section 29 of the Internal Security Act of 1982, any person can be arrested on the word of a commissioned police officer and held indefinitely if that officer has reason to believe that they may be party to a crime against the state, or if they believe they could be a material witness against a person who they believe has committed a crime against the state. And that is an indefinite detention, which is ironic, because when they passed the emergency security laws, most of the laws that were embodied in or most of the features that were embodied in the Emergency Security Act were already legislation. It was as though that they were merely putting together, finally, pieces of legislation that already existed. The slightly humorous aspect, I hope, of, at least in our case, of the security situation, happened in a town which we'll talk later about called Brantford, which is the town to which Minnie Mandela is banished to. And we were trying to get in touch with her and managed to find out who her attorney was. And from a public phone booth, the only public phone booth in this town of Brantford, after going through the operator, we finally got through to Mr. Ayub's office. And she said, "Who wants to speak to him?" And I said, "My name is Pádraig O'Malley." And she said, "Éireann go bragh," which was Gaelic. And here we are in the middle of Afrikaner territory, 8,500 miles from Ireland, where only 3% of the people speak Gaelic anyway, and somebody's on the phone speaking to me in Gaelic. And it turned out that she was Irish and had been educated by the nuns and had come to South Africa and was working in this particular law firm. So I got on to Mr. Ayub and I began to explain my business, and he cut me off very quickly and said, "You know, the phone is being tapped." And I said, I said, "Well, put me back to your secretary." So I went back to the secretary and I had a conversation with her in Gaelic, and she went away and came back to me and gave me the answers in Gaelic. And that's the particular way that we conducted that business. And the irony is, in a way, that only in South Africa is Afrikaans spoken, and only in Ireland is Gaelic spoken. And I do hope they did not have somebody who could translate Gaelic. I'd really be impressed if they did. The one other thing about the security situation is that we, among the people that we interviewed, found that a large number had been detained over the years and a large number had been jailed. And South Africa the white South Africa is a government that really believes that it follows legal precedent, so it's a very legalistic society. And we found among the people we talked to that if they were being arrested and charged with a crime and brought to court, where they would actually go through a court procedure, that they were not tortured. On the other hand, if they were detained, they were more likely to be tortured, because people are detained in order to extract information from them, which is later used against people in a court of law who are being tried before that court of law. So it's a subtle distinction. The third thing that, and perhaps the single most important thing that astonished us, was the passiveness of the black people in South Africa. There was anger, but there was no overwhelming sense of rage. No overwhelming sense of rage that you know is going to explode into a violence that will thereafter feed upon itself because of its obsession with its own constancy, or the constancy of its own obsessions. And we put this to everybody we talked to, among them Bishop Tutu. And Bishop Tutu ascribed it to something that in Zulu he called uPantu. And uPantu, he said, you cannot define it in the English language, that there is no comparable word, but it is a mixture of the black person's understanding of his humanity with his humaneness. And he went on at length to stress that black people do not operate racially in South Africa, that they are tribal, not racial, that they understand suffering, that they understand poverty, that they in fact empathize with poor or whites, because poor whites, they believe, don't know how to deal with poverty, whereas they do. Now, we'll have something more to say about that later on. But there are perhaps some other reasons that came to the fore for this passiveness. Number one would be the overwhelming level of deprivation in every aspect of black society. The hopeless do not revolt. And for many past years, given the way the government cracked down with utter ruthlessness against any expression of dissent, given that all their leaders have even been jailed or banished or are dead, given the absolute supremacy and pervasiveness of the security system, there has been indeed that sense of hopelessness. And perhaps that is changing, and that is something too we can explore later on. Another factor would be the influence of the churches. 2/3 of all blacks in South Africa are Christian. There are extensive missionary networks. Now, I will not disparage in any way the work that the churches have done, because there are many dedicated missionaries of all colours working in South Africa. However, religion has a way of telling people how to deal with adversity, has a way of telling people to love your neighbour. It has a way of being charitable. And charity has its own dangers. Among them is condescension. And what I want to make here is perhaps a larger point. That among many liberal whites in South Africa, you find a slight impatience with black people. The whites are highly organized, they know what they are doing, and you sense the impatience, so that they just wish that the blacks could get their act a little bit more together. But what they fail to understand is that they, being white, they being educated, know the intricacies of the pass laws and the homelands laws, the group areas laws, and all the myriad of legislation that the South African government has passed over the years. They know that law, and they know how to deal with it. And they know that if they ring up a government agency and ask for a reply to a question, they get a reply. But it seemed to us that they did not quite grasp, and perhaps we saw this as outsiders, is that a black person can't do that. That their access to that information and to getting a reply was precisely because they were white. And that a black person, because he or she is black, lacks the ability to ask the same question and to get a similar reply. So there's an ambiguous relationship between what I would call the liberal white and black people in South Africa. Next, what are called the influx control laws. These are the laws I really referred to when I talked about the Homelands and the Group Areas Act. Is these laws operate to make it extraordinarily difficult to effect any kind of real political organization in South Africa. Anyone who becomes politically active can simply be fired from his or her job and sent off to the homelands. And the homelands are essentially impoverished places. So it minimizes the ability by being able constantly to disperse people in any direction you want. It makes it almost impossible for blacks to develop grassroots, cohesive political organization. The same thing would apply to the Group Areas Act. The most effective thing the Group Areas Act does is that it divides one minority against another minority. It divides coloureds from Indians, Indians from blacks. And the government uses it very effectively to divide and rule. It also uses it very effectively to create what I would call an elite of the oppressed. That is, some minorities, some disadvantaged people in South Africa are better off than others. A racial system has its own pecking orders, and it works best when you pit the have-littles against the have-nots. Also, of course, in the homelands which are independent, that is Botswana, Venda, Ciskei, and the Transkei, you have these puppet black governments which dispense patronage, which dispense jobs. And these people are co-opted by the system. And they act as a buffer between the South African government and black people who, more often than not, take out their frustrations against either co-opted blacks or other minorities than against the government itself. Next, another factor that would account for the extraordinary passiveness we've talked about is the government's national security policy. 15% of all government expenditure is allocated to national defence. And here again, the government has been extraordinarily effective in dealing with the border states, in dealing with Mozambique, Angola, and internally with Lesotho and Swaziland, where they, within South Africa, have trained guerrillas and exported them or aided rebel groups that want to bring down governments in these states, and exported them into these states, and they act as a destabilizing influence in these states. As a result, they have managed to conclude agreements with all these states that in exchange for the white South African government, not training rebels and exporting them to destabilize their governments, these governments in turn have given an undertaking that their countries cannot be used as a base for the African National Congress to launch political actions into South Africa, which means that the African National Congress does not really have any external contiguous supply base where it can train its guerrillas, where it can amass weaponry, and where it can send them into forays into South Africa and then pull them back into these countries. Indeed, even this very week, the South African government has sent troops once again into Angola. And when they send troops into Angola, or indeed to other places, or send their agents in there, they go after members of the African National Congress, who they know are living there, and frequently assassinate them. Now, given that, you may ask, well, is the passiveness total? And of course it's not. As one of the people we talked to said, the younger the people, the fiercer the mood. And Bishop Tutu himself said, you know, the day will come when the people will say, enough is enough. And in his own eloquent phrase, he said, even the worm will turn. Which brings us to the next point. Many of the people, and perhaps even most of the people we talk to, could be classified as moderates, people who do not really want to see the situation explode in violence. And many of them were churchmen. And yet all said that if there was not meaningful reform now, not next year, not 2 years from now, not 5 years from now, but now, unless there was that reform now, violence was inevitable. And not only did they see it as inevitable, but as men who had preached in non-violence, they found themselves reluctantly adopting the fact that if that violence did break out on a wide level, they would not be able to condemn it. As one said, we have operated in non-violent movements for years, and the government always responds with violence. How long can we tolerate that situation? The next point that came to our attention was the fact that it would be erroneous to deal with blacks in South Africa as a monolithic group. They are united in their stand against apartheid, but there are deep divisions among blacks between urban blacks, who now account for approximately 40% of the black population, and those who live in the homelands, between educated blacks and non-educated blacks, between those who are co-opted by the system and the masses who are not, between those who believe that a liberation movement in South Africa can only succeed if there is an indigenous black consciousness that takes hold. In other words, that whites do not have any real role to play in the liberation struggle, and those who do not believe that. And of course there are tribal differences. And perhaps the tribal differences are best exemplified through Chief Buthelezi, who is chief of the Zulus, who account for about 5.6 million of the population, and who has an organization called Inkatha, which is probably the largest organized black organization in the country. And many of the people we talked to were extraordinarily bitter at Chief Buthelezi, believing in fact that he had been co-opted by the system. So in order to understand the situation fully, do not think of blacks as being a monolithic group. Next we come to the Afrikaner. The Afrikaners we met were polite, solicitous, generous, with almost an oppressive need to be liked, or at least to be understood, and at the same time they were impeccably racist. And I use the word impeccably racist deliberately, because in almost every aspect of their language and the way they expressed themselves, there was an overt racism, a belief that in fact blacks are inferior. The land, they believe, is theirs. They will not yield it easily. When they talk about South Africa, they talk about it as being their country. There is no room for the identity of other people. And perhaps what separates them from other whites in South Africa is the fact that unlike other whites who were in colonial situations, the Afrikaner has no place to go. South Africa is in effect his home. And the Afrikaans language and the Afrikaans culture are indigenous to him and to that region. And around the Afrikaner, he surrounds himself with the symbols of his own past oppressions, with the mythologies of his fight against the English. There is a siege mentality or perhaps what would be called a lager mentality that expresses itself in terms of an outside world that is hostile, that they are beleaguered, that they must be eternally vigilant, that they were victims of the English in the past, and that they are misunderstood by the world today. Their history tells them that you only survive if you conquer. And the irony here would be that they seem oblivious to the fact that they themselves will talk, or their history will talk, about the oppressions visited on them by the English, yet they themselves seem oblivious to the oppression they visit on black people in South Africa. And lurking behind all this, one gets the feeling that they anticipate some kind of divine retribution, that they would find it impossible to accept that black people could in fact treat them as equals. Given what they have done to black people, they believe that black people in turn would turn on them and do unto them what they have done to black people. The word civilization is used over and over again, and again it's a code word. They believe they are maintaining a civilization, a Western civilization, and their view of the world roughly follows these lines. South Africa is the richest region in Africa. It is the richest region because of the tenacity and entrepreneurship of whites in South Africa. Blacks in South Africa, they say, are better off than in any other region of Africa. In fact, they say, look at what happened to blacks in Uganda, in Ethiopia, where a government spent to celebrate its 10th anniversary with $250 million while millions were starving. Look at the Central Republic of Africa and Jean Bokassa. Look at Zaire. Look all around you, and you will see situations where blacks, when allowed to look after their own affairs, turned one upon the other. They'll say, look at Zimbabwe, that last year more were killed in Zimbabwe than were killed in South Africa, and yet the Western press never raised a voice to say, why pick on us? Why pick on us when particularly blacks from other countries want to come to South Africa? For example, they'll say 44% of all the people who work in the gold mines come from neighboring countries. And they say they come here because they know they will be better off than if they stayed in their own home countries. So the point is, they see black rule as leading to chaos. They see all of South Africa disintegrating into tribal civil war. They see that as a sign or as a signal for Soviet involvement for the spread of communism. And their question is, we are a bulwark against communism. Do you want South Africa to go that way? Particularly since we are of such strategic importance. The strategic importance being the shipping routes around the Cape of Good Hope and the metals, platinum, gold, chromium, cobalt, and manganese that is used by the military industrial establishment. And that's their view of the world, and they do not understand why they are being picked on when the rest of South Africa, they would argue, or the rest of Africa, they would argue, visits far more oppression upon its own people than they do upon blacks. The dilemma, of course, for white South Africa and for the Botha government in particular is that you cannot reform a regime that must be dismantled. You can't reform apartheid. You simply must find a way to abolish it. And the trouble with any government in any situation that attempts to follow the cycle of saying, we will make reforms, that invariably sets up a set of expectations. And the actual reforms never live up to the expectations they generated first, thereby merely creating a demand for more concessions, because every time a demand is acceded to, the concession becomes irrelevant. And I would refer here very briefly to Northern Ireland in the late 1960s, when you had kind of a reform government that decided to bring in some reforms. The Catholic minority found the reforms not only cosmetic but meaningless, and it merely increased their agitation for more reform. On the other hand, the Protestant majority, particularly on the right wing, thought that the reforms were excessive. So what you have in South Africa, in a way, is the development of a similar situation, where the demands are always insufficient and will always be insufficient. The reforms will always not meet black needs. On the other hand, it will give rise to, and is giving rise to, a reaction on Bothe's right. And I think at this point he is still more concerned about rebellion on his right than he is by what blacks can or cannot do. Because the one thing that the Afrikaner must maintain, if he is to still maintain his siege mentality, is the solidarity of his own people. And indeed their recent actions are undermining their own position. His speech in August, where he said, "Don't push us too far," and would give no reform, and then his statement in recent weeks that, well, they might abolish the homeland policy and allow people to have dual citizenship, and the more recent talk about some, perhaps even the abolition of the pass laws, all serve to undermine the government's position. Because the one thing they had going for them was that they were invincible, that they were in total control. And now their aura of invincibility is beginning to disappear, and they appear to be confused and not quite knowing which direction they are going. However, if it comes to the pinch, Botha, like all his predecessors, will resort to the strategy of the past. And the strategy of the past has been repress and repress ruthlessly. After Sharpsville in 1960, when 18,000 people went on a protest march, the government responded by arresting and detaining 20,000 people the following day. So their guiding premise in a way is, when the future threatens, resort to the strategies of the past. Next, you have the role of the economy, which plays a peculiar, is an agent of change in South Africa in a peculiar way. Because if the South African economy is to continue to grow, and given the fact that 40% of all Afrikaners are occupied in maintaining the bureaucracy of the state, then it can only continue to grow if there is skilled labour available. And the skilled labour, of course, has to come from blacks. The more they educate blacks to occupy positions of skilled labour, the more meaningless the homelands policy become. The more you develop a substantial black middle class, and the more you create among that middle class expectations that will demand that they be alleviated in actual access to political power. The final thing we found was, among everyone we talked to, there was a wide-scale support for sanctions. That was whether or not the person was a trade unionist or whether or not they were working. Their belief being that internally they are not sufficiently strong to mount effective opposition against the government. And what they need is an act of solidarity from the outside, and the solidarity is the important thing, not whether or not the sanctions work. Because perhaps in a white society, a white man's status depends on his job. In South Africa, a black man has no status, whether he has a job or not, as long as apartheid exists. And maybe the one thing we've seen in the last couple of weeks is, in fact, how vulnerable the South African economy is. Given that the rand had to be, or their debts had to be frozen with the devaluation of the rand, you have now the most unlikely event of all. You have the businessmen of South Africa going to Zambia to meet with leaders of the African National Congress you have the businessmen in South Africa, in effect, becoming the radicals. And I leave it at that for the moment, and let's go to the slides. I think I spoke for a little longer than I should have. Okay. We appear to have gone on a little bit. So I guess we'd call it a night. I'm sorry that there's... Yeah, okay, one question, yeah?
Summarize pretty comprehensively the arguments that are given by matters like this. I wonder what, the presentation you just made, what some of your responses might be to some of those, the itemized list that you gave of all their arguments in justification. Plus, one that I'd like to add to that, which is, after all, how is South Africa so different from America? The only difference is that the blacks survive as a majority, whereas the Indians in this country have been put on reservations and reduced to a kind of minority.
No, I think I would have a problem with that. Is that to deal with the situation as is that you have a system that is absolutely abhorrent. And I think the first thing to recognize about apartheid is that it is not a political question, that it is in fact a moral question. And once the moral dimensions of the question are raised and faced, then thereafter you attempt to figure out what is the best solution to the problem. For example, if you had the total dismantlement of apartheid tomorrow morning, instantaneous dismantling of it, there probably would be a bloodbath. So the question is, what do you do? And one of the obvious things that must be done is the release of Nelson Mandela. I mean, he is the symbol to all black people. I mean, he's now almost at mythic proportions. And that single action by the government perhaps can set in motion a dialogue between black leaderships, the black leadership that represents the black people of South Africa and the whites. Or then again, it may not. It may all be too late. But I think to make comparisons with the United States and injustices here, or even past injustices here, blurs the totality of the situation of oppression that now exists in South Africa and that must be faced.
I had a question here, if you were through. How true would you say it was to say that their Achilles heel is the economic viability of the system, to exist with all these police running around and nobody coming up to do the technical work and have the proper training for an advanced economy?
Well, if the future strength of the economy depends upon more skilled labor, that must come from blacks. If their conscious decision is not to go that route, then the rate of economic growth will in fact be slower, which means that the rate of growth of white affluence will be slower. So there is kind of an inbuilt dynamic that the system itself, in terms of its economic appurtenances, is moving in a direction that will demand some kind of dismantling of the more obvious features of apartheid, because it is as in Ireland, in Northern Ireland in the late 1960s, when civil unrest reached the proportions that led to change, didn't come from radicals. It came from a middle class that felt disenfranchised. And if there is a middle class built up in South Africa, which is more affluent, black middle class, which is more affluent, which does have more opportunity, but which is denied basic access to political power, then indeed there will be a reaction.
But you're talking about a long time when you do that.
Well, I think I earlier said that everyone says there is no long time. I mean, there is not even, we're not talking about there being 5 years at this point. You're talking about that the government probably has until the end of this year, when its debt situation, when the international banking community will have to renegotiate its debt situation, to come up with some plan.
Well, now, if you were in the U.S. Congress, would you vote for stronger sanctions?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have a couple of questions for you, sir. I'm a South African, and I'm here in the States for a year. You mentioned that white South Africans are oblivious of the conditions in the country, in the locations, because of the geographical distance and because of the situation where you don't often have a chance to go into the locations. I agree with you that it is that you don't have much chance to get into the locations, but I think that most white South Africans realize that apartheid is wrong. There's no point trying to justify the undefendable. Everyone knows that things are wrong, but we have this incredible fear and this built-in, or for me, 18 years of living in a racist society, which cannot be switched on and off in a day, in a month, in a year. So the government has been dismantling apartheid in a slow way, and it has been happening. Things that were the root of apartheid, such as the mixed marriages law, the laws about going into hotels, about going into bars, about going into cinemas. Things have been changing. And I think whites all realize that this is happening and are just very scared. You also realize, you also mentioned that white South Africans have this argument that they put forward about, what about Uganda? What about Zimbabwe? What about Zaire? What about Ethiopia? You say white South Africans don't understand why the world is looking at us and not mentioning the rest. Well, you didn't answer the question that you raised for yourself. I don't understand why. In Uganda, 100,000 people were killed in 3 years. Black against black, white against black. Oppression is wrong. No one should be oppressed. No one should be made inferior because of their race. But without trying to justify apartheid, I think time is what is needed. And the violence that is going on in the black townships does nothing more to most whites than scare them. And I think instinctively when you're scared, you will hold on to what is yours and to the power that is yours. So, again, without trying to justify apartheid, I would ask you to try and understand that people are trying to move things. Things are trying to happen. I have black friends where 5 years ago to have black friends, well, I don't know, it wouldn't have been done. My school, my old high school, is playing sports against black teams, which is, unheard of in our society. Things are changing. Hopefully they'll change quick enough, but a bit of patience and maybe more sympathy for whites' fear, and maybe things can happen a bit quicker.
Indeed.
I have another.
If my response would be, I think everything you said is very admirable, that things are changing, that there is a great fear. Unfortunately, the tragedy of most conflict situations is that things change too slow, or that the human actors lose control of the political events around them. And I think that situation is very close in South Africa, that even 2 years ago it might have been possible to say, give more time, but that there is an acceleration of events and a momentum afloat that makes that course of action less likely to succeed now. And I can say the same thing in relation to Northern Ireland, that every time somebody comes up with an initiative, it's about 2 years too late. And the the thing, if there is to be a non-violent resolution of the problem, is to try to match the pace of events with the ability of people to react to them. And that ability is not there at the moment, I think. But I think everything you said is very admirable. And what you say about the fear is especially true, and that the outside world, rather than pointing the finger, often very hypocritically, at the Afrikaner, should attempt to understand the immense complexity of South African society.
Sir, I'm coming from a country where it's a dictatorship regime, and its existence put in jail over 2 million people and killed about 300,000 others. This is to make clear that I'm against apartheid. However, having such a bad impression about the police security in Johannesburg, I have to say that to improve its image, where they were so kind to you and let you speak in Gaelic and having sent out all the documentation and having all the slides that you showed here, whereas the other countries like Afghanistan, no Western journalist can go, and they haven't mentioned. As you may know, in Afghanistan are killed daily about 5,000 people. The same what you said in this night was said about Cambodia, that we are insensitive to the regime in Vietnam and Cambodia because the communists took over. In less than 4 years, we killed over 3.5 million people, more than in 100 years in the previous regime. My problem is in question to you is that you are too optimistic about the reservation in South Africa as long as we are not fair to the whole world. We ask for divesting in South Africa, and at the same time, we invest over $60 billion in the communist countries, where they killed in 66 years over 100 million people. I'm wondering why does the press, the media, and you, sir, do not present a fair and more honest situation about both facts, and word that we can unify the people and helping each other. Otherwise, all the times the liberals will support only one side and the conservatives will be against them. The problem at this time that the United States is not moving ahead against South Africa is that we had such bad experience that the regime that we had, like in Ethiopia against Imperial Haile Selassie, we brought in power a regime and turned the country for a prosperous one into famine without drought, and the people dying daily at 1,000 rates. So as long as we don't have a chance, we don't unify against all oppressed regimes throughout the world, and we hide some sides on the right, on the left, we cannot go ahead, sir.
What you say about the atrocities in Uganda is correct. What you say about the atrocities in Cambodia is correct. I don't think that has a bearing on whether or not apartheid is a system that must be dismantled because it is morally and ethically repulsive. What I think we are saying is that it cannot be dismantled overnight because that in itself might lead to a bloodbath. But the fact that it must be dismantled must be confronted. Now, how one most expeditiously goes about that in order to ensure that it's not only done in a non-violent way, but that it ensures that the type of government that emerges in South Africa will preclude the possibility of the outrages that were committed in both Cambodia and Uganda, that is the challenge for the West. And I go back and say that it is not enough for us simply to point the finger or to simply put ourselves on a higher moral level, that if we are involved in wanting to see the situation resolved, then we must become involved in a way that attempts to take account of the totality of the situation and of the repercussions of any given action.
may I follow, sir? We are involved, but only one side. We support the Angola with the 25,000 Cuban troops supporting a regime who is not supported by its own people. We have around 10,000 Cuban troops now in Nicaragua fighting with the planes, the whole population. We are involved, but only one side. My point is that we should be involved in the fair side against the dictatorship of the right and of the left.
Okay, I think we'll have to, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it at that. We'd like to take more questions, but I think we're being thrown out. Thank you very much.